Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Arba'a ve'Esrim. The Laws of Shabbos, chapter 24. This class is being filmed live in Eretz HaKodesh, in Eretz Yisrael. The Talmud says, Avira de Eretz Yisrael machkim. Just the airspace of Israel makes one smarter. And Hashem should bless us that in this class too, it should be revealed, it should be manifest, that we come to a greater and a deeper understanding of the daily Rambam. The daily Rambam continues no matter where we are, no matter what situation we find ourselves in. Even when we're traveling, we make sure to learn the daily chapter of Rambam every day, which brings us achdut, which brings us unity with the rest of Klal Yisrael, who is learning and making their way slowly through Kol Torah Kula, through the entire Torah. I don't have all my regular equipment with me, but I was able to obtain a screen so we can continue to see the visuals that make our class so unique. And at least we have that to be able to maintain the consistency in the daily study of the Rambam. Let's get right to it. We're in the middle of a section of the laws of Shabbos that deal with what's called Shvut, the rabbinic injunctions that were added to the observance of the Shabbos. There are 39 biblical types of work that are forbidden, and the rabbis, because they saw that certain things resembled milachot, or certain things would bring or might bring somebody to transgress one of the biblical milachot, so they decreed additional prohibitions that people should stay away from so as not to resemble or not to bring one to do real melacha. That was what we spent the last 3 chapters on. Today, we're going to learn a different category of Gzeirot de Rabbanan, another category of rabbinic decrees related to Shabbos. This one, not so much because they resemble or can bring to a forbidden labor, but because of a different verse, a verse that's actually up here on the screen, which the Rambam will quote momentarily. And because of the many details mentioned in this verse, different actions were forbidden on the Shabbos so that it shouldn't resemble the weekday. That's the bottom line common denominator of all the things we're going to learn today, is that we don't want Shabbos to look like a weekday, so we refrain from doing certain actions so as to keep the Shabbos spirit. And let's see it inside in the Rambam. Halacha Aleph. Says the Rambam, Yesh dvarim shehin asurin b'Shabbat. There are certain things that are forbidden on the Shabbos, af al pi she'inam domin limlacha ve'inam mivi'in lidei melacha. Even though they're not similar to any work, they don't resemble one of the forbidden labors, and they won't even bring you to doing one of the forbidden labors. Umi pinei ma ne'esru. So why then were they forbidden? Mishum shene'emar, because it says in Isaiah, in Yeshaya, chapter 58, Im tashiv mishabat raglecha. If you will restrain your foot because of Shabbos, asot chafatzecha b'yom kodshi, and you will not do your objectives, the things that you want, on my day of holiness. V'ne'emar, the verse continues, v'chibadato me'asot drachecha. And if you will honor the Shabbos from doing your ways on the Shabbos, you'll keep away from the things that you would like to do. From attending to your wants and speaking about mundane matters. If you do all these things, then we're promised a reward. Az titanagal Hashem, you're going to have pleasure with God. God will make you ride above all the heights of the earth, etc., etc. Some great rewards. Now, from the fact that the Navi, the prophet, describes keeping Shabbos with all of these terms, not to do your needs, not to find your ways, not to speak your words. Lefichach, therefore, said the Chachamim, said the sages, Asur la'adam lahalech b'chafatzav b'Shabbat. A person cannot walk, and walk means both physically walking, we'll soon see, and also attending to his needs on the Shabbos. Va'afilu ledaber bahen, even to speak about your needs that are related to weekday activities, you shouldn't speak about them on Shabbos. For example, he'll speak it over with his partner. What should we sell tomorrow? What should we buy? Or how are we going to build this home? Or with which merchandise will I go on my trip to this specific place? Anything of this sort and like it is forbidden, as it says, that's in the blue, at the end of the verse. From the words which say you should not speak your words, dibur asur, that means that speech is forbidden. Parenthetically, we learn from this that hirhur mutar, thinking about it, just sitting there, entertaining the thoughts and not doing anything about it, is permitted. But even to speak, to engage in conversation about what you're going to do during the week, is forbidden on the Shabbos. Halacha bet, now let's talk about some actions that you should not do on Shabbos, because they're related to the weekday. Asur la'adam lifkod ganotav ustotav b'Shabbat. A person cannot check his gardens or his field on Shabbos to see what they need, or how the fruits are doing, because then the person is walking to do his needs, not Shabbos related things. It's also forbidden for a person to go on Shabbat till the end of the tchum, the border. I'll soon explain what that means. V'yeshev sham ad shetechshach, and sit there till it gets dark. Kedei sheyeh karov la'asot chafatzav b'motzei Shabbat, so he should be easily accessible to do his things after Shabbos. We're going to learn in the coming days about what's called the tchum Shabbat. Outside the borders of city limits, a person is only allowed to walk a given amount on Shabbos. We're going to see it's 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits, about 3,000 feet after the city's borders. So a person will say, you know what, okay, you tell me on Shabbos I can't go past the tchum. So I'll go till the tchum, I'll walk those 3,000 cubits, and this way I'll be 2,000 cubits, this way I'll be 2,000 cubits ahead as soon as Shabbos comes out, and I can go check my fields, which typically were located outside the tchum. People's fields, where they own their farms, etc., were usually beyond the city's borders. So you go there, and this way you gain time through walking on the Shabbos. It's not allowed. Because it'll turn out that when you walked on Shabbos, it was with the purpose of doing your needs. Even if in the end, the actual Shabbos day was never violated with anything weekday, you only simply took a walk. Since the intention of the walk was to get closer to your needs on the weekday, so it turns out that on Shabbos, you did a weekday type of walking, and that's you should stay away from. Asot chafatzecha, mimtzo chefzecha. You're not supposed to find your wants on the Shabbos. Halacha gimel b'med dvarim amurim. When do we say this? B'shehechshich al tchum la'asot davar she'asur b'Shabbat la'asoto. If the reason that you're waiting at the border till it gets dark is because the thing you want to do is something which is usually forbidden on the Shabbos. Aval im hechshich la'asot davar she'mutar la'asoto b'Shabbat. But if you're waiting at the end of the border to do something which technically would be permitted to do on the Shabbos, you simply can't do it because it's beyond the border's limits, but the act is an inherently permitted act, harei zeh mutar, then it's permitted to wait by the end of the border till Shabbos comes out. Ketzah, what does that look like? Give me some examples. Ein machshichin al atchum lahavi perot mechubarin or liskor poalin. You cannot wait at the border till it gets dark to be able to pick some fruit that are still attached to the ground or to hire workers, because those two acts are forbidden on the Shabbos. If you had something attached to the ground, you can't pick it. That's the biblical malacha of kotzer, of harvesting. Workers you're not allowed to hire on Shabbos, as we saw the other day. Aval machshichu lishmor peirot, but what you could do is wait by the border to be able to guard your produce. Sharei mutar lishmor b'Shabbat. No way, nothing against guarding fruit on Shabbos. So you can wait by the border to guard your fruit after Shabbos. Umachshich lahavi behema o perot tlushim. You can also wait by the end of the border to be able to bring an animal quicker after Shabbos, or to bring some fruit or produce that has already been picked. Shah behema, because of an animal crossing the border on Shabbos is a permitted act. You can simply call to an animal, and the animal will walk to you on its own, even if it's outside of the border. So you can get an animal to do that for you on the Shabbos. It's permitted on Shabbos, therefore it's permitted to wait for it till after Shabbos. Same thing with picked fruits. Had there been an enclosed area, had there been partitions up, you'd be able to carry it on the Shabbos. So there's no problem with waiting at the border to do it after Shabbos. A person can also tell his friend, I'm going to head to this and this city tomorrow. Why is that allowed? Seemingly you're engaging in weekday talk. Because if there would be huts on the way to that city, he would even walk there on Shabbos. The Rambam is referring to a principle which we're going to learn in the coming days in chapter 27, 28, that even though every border has a certain tchum, every city has a certain tchum, as I mentioned, you can only walk a certain amount outside of a city, so long as there are still huts on the road outside of the city limits continue to extend. And to the point that if you have a number of huts between two cities, you can technically walk to Shabbos, on Shabbos from one city to the other because of the huts that are located along the road. So the Rambam says, if you tell your friend, I'm going to another city tomorrow, it isn't necessarily an inherently weekday act. Technically, you could walk there on Shabbos had there been huts. So the walking isn't an inherently prohibited act. Therefore, you can talk about it on the Shabbos. And the same applies to anything similar. A person can tell his worker, tell me, what do you think? You think you can come to me in the evening after Shabbos? You're asking it in a question tone, that's allowed. Don't tell him, be ready in the evening. Because then you're actually fulfilling your needs on the Shabbos. It's forbidden to run. It's also forbidden to skip, to walk in a skipping manner on Shabbos. As it says, on Shabbos you stick away. Where's that verse? On Shabbos you stick away from doing your paths. Doing your paths can be in a more abstract level, the things that you need to get done. But paths also has the connotation of literally walking. On Shabbos, you're not supposed to walk in the way you would walk on the weekday. Shelo yehi hiluchach shel Shabbat ki hiluchach shel chol. The walking you do on Shabbos shouldn't resemble the walking of the weekday. The weekday you run, the weekday you skip. On Shabbos you walk calmly. However, a person is allowed to descend on Shabbos to a pit or to a ditch or to a cave, even if they're 100 amot, 150 feet deep, and he can climb all the way down to take a drink of water and then climb back up and go out. Those are okay matters because that's not a weekday activity. You got to drink. A person cannot increase in idle talk on the Shabbos, just useless conversation. Shenemar, as it says, v'daber davar, stay away from speaking certain words. Shelo yehi diburach shel Shabbat, diburach shel chol. The speech you do on Shabbos shouldn't be like the speech you do during the weekday. Halacha hey mutar larutz b'Shabbat lidvar mitzvah. To run for a mitzvah, that's allowed on Shabbos. Kagon shiarutz lebet haknesset lebet midrash, running to shul, running to the study hall. Umechashvin cheshbonot shel mitzvah. You can also calculate mitzvah-related calculations. You can measure mitzvah-related measurements. You can go to mikveh. Let's say you have to measure a mikveh, leidayim yesh kashiur, if there's enough water in the mikveh to be able to dip in it. Or beged leidayim mikabel tumah, or you can measure a cloth to see if it's enough to contract ritual impurity. We saw this the other day when it came to the amount of how much you have to carry. So we mentioned that cloth has to be a certain size to be able to contract ritual impurity. And here you want to measure on the Shabbos to see if it meets that criteria. You can do that. Uposkin stakala aniyim. You could also pledge to give tzedakah to the poor people. That's why today, in shul, like Kriyat Torah, people promise to give donations. It isn't considered a weekday act because it's for tzedakah. And a person is able to walk to shul or to study halls, even to theaters and halls belonging to Gentiles, if it's to take care of public matters on the Shabbos. Even though seemingly it's a weekday activity, you're not walking to shul to daven, and certainly to the theater, but you're going to take care. But since you're going to take care of communal matters, it's for the needs of the public. That's also allowed on Shabbos. You can also make shidduchim, make marriages, kids to get engaged to each other. They used to do that in the early times. When kids were very young, they would engage them, and then when they would get older, they would actually get married. So you can do this shidduch on Shabbos. You can make up about a child to teach him a certain Torah book or to teach him a trade. That's part of education. It's allowed. Preparing for education is allowed on Shabbos. We can visit the sick, comfort the mourners. But when one goes to visit the sick, you shouldn't say a usual blessing. You shouldn't mention the sickness. Rather, Omer, you should say, Shabbat hi milizok. It's Shabbos. We shouldn't be crying out. Healing is coming. Healing is quick and coming. You don't express the request for the sick person because we don't do that on Shabbos. We may also wait by the end of the border on Shabbos to take care of matters related to a bride, a wedding, and matters related to a dead person. To bring him a coffin, to bring him shrouds. And you can even give the instruction, you could even be detailed, go to this place to find the coffin or the shrouds. Lo matzata sham have mimkom ploni. You don't find it here, bring from somewhere else. Lo matzata b'maneh have b'matayim. You didn't find for $100, bring for $200. Ubilvad shalo yaskir lo schum mekach. As long as you don't mention the exact number that you're willing to pay, you can give all the details that you need. Shekol elu v'chayotze bahen mitzvahim. Because all of these things, all of these pursuits are a mitzvah. V'ne'emar, and it says in the verse, what's the problem? Asot chafatzecha, to do your needs. Which means chafatzecha asurin, cheftei shamayim mutarin. The needs of yours are forbidden. The needs of heaven are allowed. Halacha vav mafligin bayam hagadol be'erev Shabbat lidvar mitzvah. Another thing related to doing mitzvahs is that we can take a trip into the Great Sea, even on erev Shabbat, if it's for a mitzvah. We're going to have this more in chapter 30. We're going to see about this. That on Friday you're not supposed to engage in excess traveling, but just like when it comes to Shabbos itself, when it's mitzvah related, you can waive certain restrictions. So too on Friday, you can take a trip into the Great Sea on Erev Shabbat if it's for a mitzvah. You speak to the captain, you tell him to stop on Shabbos, but even if he doesn't actually stop on Shabbos, you did your part, and that's okay. We may annul vows on the Shabbos. This is a whole section of halacha that we're going to deal with later on in the 6th book of the Rambam, where the Torah authorizes a father or a husband to nullify his daughter's or his wife's vows under certain conditions. And that can be done also on the Shabbos. Bein letzorech Shabbat, bein shlo letzorech Shabbat. Whether the vow is directly related, necessary for Shabbos, or it's not. But you can nullify the vow on the Shabbos. It has to do, the reason for this is because a father or a husband can only nullify the vow on the day that he hears it. So if he only heard it on the Shabbos, he must nullify it that day, otherwise he loses his right. You can also ask a Torah sage about vows that are related to the Shabbos, and he can nullify them as well. This is a different kind of annulment, not a special grant by the Torah for a father and a husband. The Torah also gives a permission that if a person regrets his vow under certain conditions, he can go to a Torah sage who will then cancel the vow for him. Here, though, you can't go for any vow, only a vow that's related to Shabbos. For example, a guy made a promise, I'm not going to drink wine ever. Comes Shabbos, he has to make Kiddush. Oh, he goes running to the Torah sage, and the sage helps him annul it because that's related to Shabbos. But if it wasn't related to Shabbos, you can't annul it by the Torah sage on Shabbos. Even if in the given cases. Technically, there would have been time to nullify the vow before Shabbos. You can do it on Shabbos, because these things, also go into the category of a mitzvah. Halacha Zayin. Although we mentioned that mitzvahs take away certain restrictions on the Shabbos, there are some mitzvahs which don't push away Shabbos. For example, ein onshin b'Shabbat. The high court may not administer punishment on Shabbos. Afal pisha ha'onesh mitzvah taseh eina docha Shabbat. Even though the punishment in certain cases is a biblical commandment, it doesn't override the Shabbos. Ketzah, what does that mean? If a person was liable in high court to get lashes or to get the death penalty, the high court does not give the lashes or the death penalty on Shabbos. Shenemar, as it says, and this is quite an interesting pasuk. It says, "Lo tiva'aru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom haShabbat." You shall not light a fire in all of your dwellings on the Shabbos day. Simply understood, it's a reference to the melacha of kindling a fire. But the Talmud learns out, zu azhara lebeidin. This lighting of the fire is a warning to the high court. Shelo yisrefu b'Shabbat mishen itchayev sreifa. That if somebody was liable to the death penalty of burning, there are 4 types of death penalties that the high court can give. One of them was burning. If somebody was liable to be burnt, they should not light that fire on the Shabbos. And from there we learn that the same way burning is not allowed, we don't administer any punishment on the Shabbos. A person can guard his fruit, his produce on the Shabbos, whether they're attached to the ground or detached. And if a person comes to try to steal the fruit, or an animal or a beast comes to eat from these fruit, he can scream at them, he can hit them, he can distance them, all allowed on the Shabbos. Isn't that a person's needs? Why should it be allowed? Because the only prohibition is to buy for yourself, to acquire new objects which weren't around before, or to gain, to make some profit, to take care of pleasure that's going to come to your benefit, that will come to your property soon. But simply to protect the property which you already own, to keep it in the status quo, mutar, that's allowed. You're not looking to get more of your own stuff. What can this be compared to? Can a person lock his house on Shabbos to avoid thieves? Of course he can. He wants to guard whatever he already has. If a person is guarding his plants from birds, or a person is guarding his cucumber and pumpkin plants from the animals, when he acts like a scarecrow or he scares away these animals, he shouldn't clap his hands or dance the way he would do during the weekday. For fear that he might take a pebble and end up throwing it and transgress the biblical commandment of carrying 4 cubits in a public domain. Halacha Yud, the general principle which governs all of the rabbinic enactments we've had the last 4 days. Anything which is forbidden on the Shabbos because of a rabbinic enactment, lo gazru alehen ben hashmashot. The whole decree was never made during the twilight zone going into Shabbos. Ela ba'atzmo shel yom hu she'ein asurin. Only in the actual day of Shabbos it's forbidden. Aval ben hashmashot mutarin. But twilight is allowed. So long as it's a mitzvah involved or some pressure, some extenuating circumstance. Ketzah, what does that mean? Mutar lo ben hashmashot, a person can, during twilight zone, la'alot be'ilan or lashut al pnei hamayim, he can climb a tree or swim, 2 things that are forbidden rabbinically, lahavi lulav or shofar, to bring a lulav or a shofar. I took this picture from earlier in the laws of Shabbos where we had shofar in a tree and a knife for brit milah in the water. But I just added a lulav there for fun. So you can go on a tree or take a swim to get your lulav or to get your shofar. And Eruv Sha'asa. You can also take down from a tree or take out of a Carmelit an Eruv. If you made an Eruv, you chipped in, we're going to soon see in the next set of laws the idea of an Eruv. I'm not going to get into it, but the point is that in order for certain people to carry in a shared public space, they all have to join in to own a certain piece of food jointly, and it would be hosted in one of the homes, and that allows them to carry in the shared public space. So if the Eruv food was hosted and was put on a tree or in a Carmelit, usually areas which you cannot get to on the Shabbos, if it's ben hashmashot, you got to get it out. You can take it from the tree or from the Carmelit. If a person was also just busy, super agitated, and during twilight he needed to do something that was rabbinically forbidden, it's permitted. But if it wasn't a mitzvah and there was no pressure, asur, then it's forbidden, even during twilight. Therefore, if you have produce that's untithed, for sure untithed, you may not tithe it during the twilight zone. Even though we saw yesterday that the whole reason for the prohibition of not separating maaser on Shabbat is a rabbinic injunction. Shouldn't look like you're fixing a vessel, etc. But if it's doubtfully untithed produce, that you can tithe on the Shabbos. If a child is caught on Shabbos doing something that is rabbinically forbidden, for example, he picked something out of a flower pot which had no hole, so it's isolated growth, it's not attached to the ground, that's rabbinically forbidden, or he was carrying in a Carmelit, the high court isn't commanded to stop him. If his father let him do that, we don't protest him. And now, the Rambam introduces another rabbinical concept related to Shabbos, which we're going to be exploring for the next few days. And this is called muktzeh. Muktzeh means things that are set aside. Certain things you don't touch on the Shabbos without reason. The sages forbade us from moving around certain things on Shabbos the way you would during the weekday. How did they get to this prohibition? They said the following. Look at the verse we had before, yeah? You're supposed to stay away from your human needs on Shabbos. If the prophets warned and commanded us that you shouldn't even walk on Shabbos the way you walk during the weekday, and you shouldn't talk on Shabbos the way you talk on the weekday, because it says you shouldn't speak certain things, how much more so certainly the things we move and the things we touch on Shabbos shouldn't be the same thing as we move on during the weekday. So it shouldn't turn into a weekday in your eyes. They're going to start picking up things, moving things around from corner to corner, from house to house, or hide certain stones that you liked to keep them for later. And then you're going to be, sitting in your house doing nothing. You can't do much work on the Shabbos. And you're going to look for things to do. And in the end, you're not going to rest on the Shabbos. And the whole idea of Shabbos, which Torah expresses as a reason for resting, if you're going to touch and move whatever you do during the weekday, you're not going to end up resting. Furthermore, if you're going to check and move around vessels that are normally used for prohibited things on the Shabbos, we're going to explore this more tomorrow. There are certain types of utensils that their typical use is an act which is forbidden on Shabbos. So if you're going to touch those stuff, you actually might end up using them and come to do work. And furthermore, a third reason, some people unfortunately don't have a job. They just do nothing all day. Tourists, people that sit in the street corners, do nothing. Anyway, every day is rest day for them. Were it to be permitted to walk and to speak and to touch whatever you wanted to touch and move like any other day, these leidegers, as we call them in Yiddish, these people that have nothing to do, won't have any tangible way to say they rested on the Shabbos. Why is Shabbos different than the rest of the week for you? Resting from these things, which the sages enacted, is an equal resting for everybody. Everybody can point and say, you see, I didn't walk like I walk on Shabbos, I didn't speak like I speak on Shabbos, I didn't move things around like I move things on Shabbos. For these three reasons, number one, It shouldn't be like a weekday. Number 2, you shouldn't come to do work. Number 3, you should be able to have a tangible Shabbos. For these reasons, Nag'u be'isur tiltul, the sages came upon the prohibition of moving, v'asru shelo yataltel adam b'Shabbat, ela kerim hatzarich lehen, and they forbade that a person should not move things on the Shabbos unless he needs them, kemo she'yitba'er, as shall be explained in the next 2 chapters, be'ezrat Hashem.